Joining us right now via Zoom chat is Braden Langley from Langley Outdoors Academy, which you can find linked up on YouTube. Check his YouTube channel out, Langley Outdoors Academy. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Good morning.
Praise be to God. We're glad to have you on board. Now, constitutional carry is a story that came out a couple of days ago, and I think that gun rights and gun laws have kind of gone under the radar because there's a lot of big news in the cycle these days, and a lot of people have been distracted by that. So I thought it might be a good time to catch up on what is the status of gun regulation in America today. And do I see this story out of Breitbart that's suggesting constitutional carry is now growing, 21 states now, and growing to a bunch of others. So we thought we'd invite you on. Maybe you can tell us what is the latest information. But let's start with, can you tell us, maybe define some terms, what is constitutional carry?
Well, essentially, constitutional carry is the idea that the government is mandated to allow you to do these things through the Constitution, right? So if you've got the idea of, hey, I have a firearms right, I have the right to defend myself via that firearms right, is it really up to the government to tell me if I can or cannot utilize that right? So you have, you have a bunch of states, especially the leftward-leaning states around gun control specifically, where they will come in and they'll say, yes, you have that Constitution right, but we'll let you know when you can use it, how you can use it, and if you can use it, right? It's a debate between may issue and shall issue, right? So in the right-leaning states, the shall issue is basically a mandate from that state saying, no, you're going to do this. It's just a matter of time. On the may issue, like New York, California, you're at a point where the state decides if you're going to. A lot of the cases in that area, like the New York Supreme Court case that's going through right now, it's all around, I might give it to you if you prove that you need it. And the whole point really boils down to, is the state in the place where they can tell me if I do or do not need a constitutionally guaranteed right. That's the political side. The practical side every day is you can carry your firearm without a piece of paper from the government allowing you to. That's the idea. That's where you hear permitless carry. That's why you hear a lot of the arguments that we have.
Now, I'm right now currently sitting in the state of Texas, the great state of Texas, and we adopted constitutional carry in 2021. And I recall early 2021, before it was enacted here, before it was signed into law by the governor, people were making wild claims about Texas going to become the wild, wild west, now that everybody's going to be strapping 6-irons to the hip. And to be honest with you, maybe I just live in a little bubble, but I just have not seen that materialize. What are people saying about constitutional carry around the country?
So from what I'm seeing around the country, because obviously on my YouTube channel, there's not like a defined area, right? So you've got people from all the way in California with extreme gun control, then all the way to Texas, all the way up to Maine. Like, people are really jumping in this conversation. And honestly, it's a lot of movement in the forward direction for constitution carry. Okay. So if you look at the legislatures across the nation, a lot of them are moving in the direction. As you mentioned earlier on, there's 21 states that already do this. A bunch were added last year. And then you mentioned Texas was one of them. And this year, you're slated to see 6 more potentially go that same way. So you could be sitting at 27 nationwide before the midterm elections. And so, obviously, that's a dramatic increase. If you include Tennessee from last year, Texas, Missouri, like a lot of the states that really kind of initiated this, I don't believe you're going to have that many states jump on board in that many parts of the different parts of the country if you don't have public buy-in. That's kind of, to me, that's just a high level observation, but obviously in my circles, everyone's for it. But completely honest, I'm completely biased on it. So I'll tell you that.
I'm sure you are. Right now, I think Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Nebraska, and Ohio are all considering it right now. I'm surprised Alabama hasn't already done that, to be honest with you. But they're on the docket now considering that. But, in Texas, so when constitutional carry became law, one thing that became clear to me as a outsider knuckle dragger, I love guns. I own guns. I shoot guns. I hunt. I'm in that camp. However, it became clear that constitutional carry is a term that doesn't literally mean, I think, what people think it means. There were still limits to what could be done, and maybe you can explain those.
Yeah. No. So you're correct. So if you look at the very broad definition of constitutional carry, like what we were just talking about a few moments ago, That's the overarching broad view, right? There are still places where in certain states, you're not going to carry a firearm in those areas. Like public schools is a really big one in some states. Government buildings, those rules don't change. It's not like you all of a sudden have this right where guns are everywhere. They're in the courtroom. They're in the traffic court. That doesn't change. The main thing about constitutional carry it's simple in a way, but it's also kind of broad, is you're just removing the ability for the government to permit you for a guaranteed right. The rules that are still in place still exist. And one of the things that the left is kind of aligning to on the gun argument is, well, now anybody can just be carrying a gun. Well, anybody could carry a gun before. The only difference is the government's telling you if you could or you couldn't. And the next argument is, well, what about background checks? Well, the background checks are done before the gun is purchased. Nothing changes, right? So in one aspect, change, obviously sometimes people are uncomfortable with change across the board, and that's a human thing. That's not a left, right, or center thing. That's just a human thing, right? But the big thing here is it affects a lot less than people think. And if you get into the argument of, well, what about this one scenario? What about this one scenario? This, like you said, the Wild Wild West, it's not really accurate, right? I mean, if you look back from early 2021, 2020, all those years before that, the big joke across the country was always Texas is always strapped. Texas always has guns. Like that was the whole joke. I mean, like if you walk into a store in Texas, you're going to see more guns than you are what you're to buy. I mean, that was the joke across the country. And I find it interesting that the conversation changes from 2019. Well, it's, there's so many guns in Texas to 2021 when it's now constitutionally endorsed to carry that gun in Texas. Like, well, then now there's so many guns in Texas. I'm like, you're saying the exact same thing.
Right.
What changed? Nothing really changed except the ability for the government to tell you could or you couldn't carry it.
We're very close to a break at this point. We're going to end up having to take a very quick break, and then we'll continue our conversation right on the other side of that. Langley Outdoors Academy. Before we jump into that break, tell me real quick about that. You got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So the YouTube channel is something I started literally in my garage. I just wanted to put some information out there about the Second Amendment. At the time, I was working in a gun range.
We're about to run out of time. What's the website?
It's YouTube. It's Langley Outdoors Academy.
Langley Outdoors Academy on YouTube. More on that, though, on the other side of this break. We were talking about concealed carry versus constitutional carry before the break, but you brought something up a minute ago that I want to tap into, and that was background checks. It's one of those things that gets hotly contested every time there's a tragedy in the news about a gun violent shooting or whatever. Apparently, we don't cover what happens in Chicago every single weekend, but either way, it's neither here nor there. Every time there's a big tragedy in the news, and we hate tragedies, by the way. We want to avoid them, not have them. And but background checks come up. Every time I've bought a gun, I've had to go through a background check. How about you, Braden Langley?
Oh, every single time. I mean, without fail, you are going to go through that background check. And that's one of the things that I deal with a whole lot, just having conversations with people that aren't in the gun world that much. You are not going to buy a gun from anyone registered that is selling that gun as a business without doing a background check. It is not possible. And the really fascinating part about it is like, well, we have all these guns going through without background checks. I was like, the FBI literally calls on every single sale. It goes through the background check on every single sell. You have the serial number. You have all this information. You have the driver's license, the living address. You have all this information. But it's one of those things, if you say it early enough and often enough, then it becomes true, even though it's not.
Is that true for gun sales at expos?
Well, so if you are actually a FFL dealer, right? Like if you actually have a business and you are reporting sales from a business perspective, you're doing the background checks. Like if you go into a gun show, like one of the favorite conversations is the gun show loophole. The gun show loophole doesn't exist. The idea that a business is regulated in their place of business, but then when they step outside of the confines of the business, they're not regulated. It's pretty low hanging fruit. I feel like that's a pretty easy one to see. That's not exactly true, right? If you are selling as a legal entity, you're doing that background check. You don't want to have that conversation with the ATF. Trust me, you don't want that one.
Speaking of ATF, didn't we see an article, a report that came out maybe a couple months back that these these dealers were closing down and shipping their records off to the ATF, and the ATF is now digitizing them?
Well, so yes, there was a report of that. So here's where you kind of get into a very interesting, sticky situation. And this part is where I personally find it very fascinating. I'm sure they did ship all of that information to the ATF. The ATF already had a copy of that. The big problem is actually not does the ATF or the DOJ know that those guns existed. The big problem is how long they're kept and are they digitized? Because if they're digitized, that's a federal registry. And there's actually laws that prohibit the ability to digitize all that information. And I did a report, probably about 10 to 11 months ago, all around the fact that the ATF was actually complaining that the floor was giving way because of the weight of the paper.
Wow.
And they have all of these off-site storage facilities. And it really was. The article, you have to consider timing when all these things come out. It was right when David Chipman was being nominated for the ATF director. So there was a lot of pro-ATF, give them the resources, give them the people, give them the leader, all of those things in that push, which failed, by the way. But that was a big piece of it. Like, it's not being digitized as of now, at least legally and out in the public.
Mr. Langley, I like your YouTube channel, by the way. I was watching it yesterday. And in one of your videos, you described the ways that the anti-2A lobby tends to go too far, and then they get reined in.
100%.
And ends up being a win for the pro-2A lobby. Could you describe that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the most beautiful things about our Constitution and our form of government is the government is regulated by that Constitution. There are rules and there are boundaries that the government cannot cross. There are rights that are guaranteed to the individuals, right? And when you have a situation where a guaranteed right, the Second Amendment is guaranteed, the move, and I said this on my YouTube channel a lot, it's a lot harder for the left to take the gun rights than for the right to defend them. They have to go against the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. They have to go against local ordinances. They have to go against the culture. They have to go against a lot of things that a lot of people in the gun community and the gun world don't. I know that they know this, but they're very concerned about defending from their perspective, which is 100% legitimate. But if you look at what they have to overcome, we have the advantage. And then if you go into the individual local ordinances, if you go into the individual states, like particularly California, Chicago, New York, they're constantly doing things that are not violating the Second Amendment. They're just kind of bending the Second Amendment in their own, and that's their own definition, right? So you can have a gun, but that 11th bullet in the magazine or cartridge in the magazine, yeah, that goes too far. So you can have 10. You can still have the gun. You can still have your rights, but you can't have 10 rounds for that right. Or you can't have this specific firearm. Hey, but you have the other ones. And what happens is you end up in a point where they push and they push and they push and they get sued. And when they get sued, the courts go, listen, I know what you're saying here, but that's clearly against the Constitution. You can't mandate what people have to buy. You can't curtail a Second Amendment right that is given to these individuals because it's our guaranteed rights. And that's what you have in New York right now. This case in New York, the SCOTUS case, basically two guys wanted to buy guns, and the government said, no, you can't because you don't have a good enough reason. And they sued them, and the Supreme Court heard arguments. And the Supreme Court was like, what are you guys talking about? I mean, it really did not sound good for the gun controllers at all. And the big thing here is they push too far. And when they push too far, they're typically virtue signaling, and they're trying to achieve their moral superiority. And I'm not trying to be aggressive. I'm just saying that's what they go for. That's their move, right? And they get pulled back into place, and then all those rules that they did across all the gun control cities have to get revoked, removed, and rewritten. So if this New York case falls, that means Chicago, Los Angeles, all of these states can't do, we might give you the gun. No, now it's, no, you will. And they have to rewrite everything. So it's kind of like a rubber band effect.
That's really interesting. I know we talked about briefly in the last segment about that the idea or the term constitutional carry is kind of a misnomer, but we were talking about this whole time. Like, we have a constitutional right to the right to bear arms, and we have all this infringement on it, and there's all these qualifications. Well, yes, you have a right to bear arms, but only this kind of gun, only this kind of weapon. In Texas, you can drive a tank, but you can't have treads on it. But elsewhere, you're not allowed to do that. So what exactly would a real constitutional carry look like? I know in Texas before we had constitutional carry, you could carry long guns around in Texas openly, and that was no problem. But what would a real constitutional carry look like?
So, I mean, that's kind of a broad question, right? So it depends on the time frame that you're in, and it also depends on what the frame and the scope of the conversation. So where we're at right now, you're talking about carrying your firearm that you legally own, that the background checks have gone through, and you're not a felon. There's no flags on your record. You can carry that. You don't need to ask the state's permission to carry that. That would be modern times. If you go back before the 1930s, before Prohibition, I mean, it was literally, that was the Wild Wild West. I mean, I'm going to be honest. Like we did an article on my news source, the Second Press, when it was all about, hey, all this gun control came about during Prohibition. And the Attorney General at the time, I believe his last name was Cummings, he actually came out, and this is in the 30s, and he was saying like, well, Americans just need to put up with the fact that it's going to be inconvenient, but we got to stop these criminals. It's important. They've got more guns than the Army and the Navy. That's an actual quote. So this fear mongering and this manipulation has been going on since Prohibition. And interestingly enough, Prohibition went away, but the National Firearms Act, which was actually spawned from the Prohibition, stayed. So if you're talking about a true ability to bear arms, and through the Constitution literally says, no, you guys get it. The whole point is to defend against an oppressive, tyrannical government. Now, I'm not advocating that. I mean, I don't want to say that we need these to fight tanks and M16s, like F-15s and all that.
Yeah, we're going to lose.
But
we all remember Waco.
Right. And that's the big piece here. It's not about the false bravado of I'm going to stand up and I'm going to have, my weapon and I'm going to defend my right to live as a peaceful, as an American from that perspective, right? It's much more we have these rights. We have the ability to do these things because we're building on a foundation that our rights were guaranteed, right? And something that I talk about a lot is and it's kind of lost sometimes because the fight is so important on the small side, like what we're dealing with right now. We're the next generation inheriting these rights from those that came before us, who died for us, who sacrificed for us, who protected these rights. And it's our turn to hold the torch. Mm. This is not something that's brand new and we're defending one of our ideas. This is a lineage. This is a continuation. And that's what kind of drives me. It's like, if I think about people who stormed the beaches of Normandy, if I think about people who fought in the Revolutionary War, if I think about all the different pieces of our country, 600,000 people in the Civil War, like that's not small. And that's something that's worth having that conversation on.
Hey, man, we're just about out of time here with Braden Langley, Langley Outdoors Academy on YouTube. Real quick, again, about a minute and a half. Tell us about your YouTube channel.
Yeah, so basically what we do on that YouTube channel is we look at the political news of the day for the Second Amendment, what's going on, blue cities, red cities, nationwide, federal, and we analyze and we really dive into what's actually happened, right? Because there's a lot of different players on the federal level. There's a lot of different people and backgrounds, and we really dive into the relationships and kind of the counts of where the votes are. What are the rules they can and can't do? Can they actually sneak this gun control into a budget bill? No, they can't because of the Byrd rule. All of these different nuances to the Senate and the government and the House of Representatives. And then we look at the actual odds and we talk about it honestly, to be fair. Like I do not fearmonger. That's not my thing. Let's talk about this. Let's figure out a plan. Let's move forward. Yeah. Right. And that's the YouTube channel is all about Second Amendment rights and finding that why and driving with it. All
right. Praise be to God. Braden Langley, Langley Outdoors Academy. Check him out on YouTube. Thank you, sir. God bless you. God love you. Have a great day.
Thank you, sir.
All right. That is going to do it for hour number 1 of Catholic Drive Time. Praise be to God. Thank you for joining us for that.